"This is my son's locket." The words crashed over Catherine like frozen stones, making her entire world tremble. She froze, the cleaning brush slipping from her shaking hands and clattering against the castle's marble floor. The sound echoed through the empty gallery like a gunshot. The Alpha King stood above her, a mountain of a man with dark eyes that burned with an intensity bordering on madness. His fingers pointed directly at the golden locket hanging from her neck, the only treasure she possessed, the only proof that someone had once loved her. But this was impossible. Completely impossible. Catherine raised her hand instinctively, clutching the locket against her chest as if she could protect it from the truth that was about to destroy everything. Her voice came out in a broken whisper, barely audible in the heavy silence that had descended upon the corridor. "It was a gift. From my boyfriend. He gave it to me." The king's eyes narrowed, and something dangerous danced in their depths. Something like hope mixed with 2 decades of pain. Something that made his alpha emerge, powerful and terrifying. "Your boyfriend." He pulled his own locket from inside his tunic, identical to hers, and when the two came close, both exploded in golden light, ancient runes dancing across their surfaces. There were only 2 of these in the world. I had them made when my son was born, one for him, one for me. Catherine's breath failed. No. Where is he?" The king's voice was a command that made the walls tremble. "Where is the man who gave you this locket?" And Catherine realized, with growing horror, that the man who had rejected her, who had broken her heart because she wasn't good enough for his family, was the kingdom's lost prince. The son the Alpha King had desperately searched for 23 years. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are. I hope you enjoy the story. The stone floors whispered secrets beneath her knees as she scrubbed, each stroke of the brush a prayer for invisibility. The castle of the Alpha King rose around her like a mountain of judgment, all cold marble and colder eyes. She was nothing here, less than nothing, a rejected Omega whose wolf had been deemed unworthy by the mate the moon goddess herself had chosen for her. But she needed to survive, and survival meant working in shadows, accepting the crumbs of mercy thrown by those who would never see her as whole. Her name was Catherine, though few bothered to learn it. 20 years of life had carved delicate lines into her pale face, and her white hair, rare and ethereal, caught the torchlight as she moved through the corridors like a ghost. She kept her head down, always down, letting that silver cascade shield her from stares and whispers. The other servants gave her a wide berth, as if rejection were contagious, as if her broken bond might somehow taint their own futures. But there was one thing she never hid, one defiance she allowed herself. Around her neck hung a golden locket, simple yet exquisite, warmed by her skin and her memories. It was the only beautiful thing she owned, the only proof that once someone had loved her. Her fingers found it constantly, tracing its smooth surface like a talisman against the cruelty of the world. The Alpha King's castle was a labyrinth of power and prestige. Aiden Silverlake ruled these lands with an iron fist wrapped in velvet diplomacy, his reputation forged in battle and tempered by loss. He was a man carved from stone and shadow, his black hair threaded with silver at the temples, his beard meticulously groomed, his dark eyes holding depths that no one dared to plumb. He walked the halls with the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders, yet there was a hollowness in him that even his strongest warriors could sense. 23 years ago, the king had known joy. His son had been born under a full moon, a prince with lungs that proclaimed his arrival to every corner of the realm. Aiden had held that tiny, perfect creature and felt his heart expand beyond what he thought possible. He had commissioned a locket, pure gold inscribed with ancient wolf runes, a protection charm, and a symbol of unbreakable bonds. He had clasped it around his infant son's neck with trembling hands, whispering promises of love and legacy. 3 days later, his mate, Celine, had vanished with the child. No ransom demand came. No body was ever found. The kingdom had been scoured, forests burned in desperate searches, rivers dragged until the water ran muddy with disturbed silt. Witches had been consulted, seers had thrown their bones, trackers had followed trails that led nowhere. It was as if the earth had opened and swallowed them whole, leaving only silence and a father's howling grief. Aiden had never taken another mate. He had never stopped searching, and he had never removed the identical locket he wore, twin to the one he had placed on his son. It rested against his chest now as he strode through the eastern wing, reviewing security measures with his beta, a constant reminder of what he had lost. He barely noticed the Omega scrubbing the floors until her scent hit him. It was wrong, somehow. Not unpleasant, but sharp and jarring, like a chord struck off key. Rejection had a smell, acrid and broken, and it clung to her like smoke. But beneath it was something else, something that made his wolf stir with interest for the first time in years. He slowed his pace, his beta's voice fading into background noise. She was bent over her work, white hair spilling forward like a waterfall of moonlight, so focused, so small. And then he saw it, the locket, swinging gently as she moved, catching the light and throwing it back in golden sparks. His heart stopped. The world narrowed to that single point of gleaming metal. It was impossible. There had only been two, crafted by the finest goldsmith in the realm, embedded with protection spells that made them unique, irreplaceable. One around his neck, one lost with his son. His hand shot out, gripping his beta's arm hard enough to bruise. The other man fell silent immediately, following the king's gaze. Catherine felt the weight of attention before she heard the footsteps stop. The back of her neck prickled, her wolf whimpering in instinctive submission, even as broken as she was. She froze, brush dripping soapy water onto the stone, her pulse beginning to hammer. Slowly, so slowly, she raised her eyes. The Alpha King stood above her, a mountain of a man with eyes like a winter storm, and he was staring at her throat with an expression that bordered on madness. "Where did you get that?" His voice was low, dangerous, each word precisely controlled. Catherine's hand flew to the locket, clutching it protectively. "It was a gift," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "From whom?" The king took a step closer, and she could feel the power radiating off him in waves, making her wolf cower and her human heart race with fear. She swallowed hard. "My partner. He gave it to me." Something flickered across the king's face, something raw and desperate. "Who is your partner? What is his name?" "Elian." The name fell from her lips like a confession. "Elian Whitmore." The beta sucked in a sharp breath. The king went perfectly still, so still he might have been carved from stone. When he spoke again, his voice was barely human. "Describe him." Catherine's fingers trembled against the locket. "He's 23, dark hair with gold in it when the sun hits just right. His eyes are gray like storm clouds. He has a scar here," she touched her left eyebrow, "from when he fell from a tree as a child, or so he told me. He's strong but gentle, and he laughs like thunder, and he—" Her voice broke. "He rejected me 3 months ago when he discovered I was his fated mate. He said his family would never accept an Omega from the lower districts, that I would ruin his future." The beta was already moving, barking orders at guards who materialized from the shadows. The king crouched down, bringing himself to her level, and up close she could see the tremble in his hands, the wetness gathering in those fierce dark eyes. "How long have you known Elian?" he asked, and there was a gentleness in his voice now that made her chest ache. 2 years. We were in love, or I thought we were, before the bond snapped into place." She looked down at the locket. "He gave me this on our first anniversary, said it had been in his family, that it was precious to him, but I was more precious still. A sound escaped the king, something between a laugh and a sob. His hand reached out, hesitated, then carefully, so carefully, he touched the locket with one finger. Catherine felt the jolt of magic that passed between the two pieces, saw the runes flare briefly with golden light. "This is my son's locket," the king whispered, his voice breaking on the last word. The world tilted. Catherine stared at him, unable to process, unable to breathe. "I don't understand. My son was taken from me when he was 3 days old. I have searched for him for 23 years. Aiden's eyes bore into hers with desperate intensity. "This locket is one of a pair. I had them made, spelled them myself with blood magic to recognize each other. There are only 2 in existence." He reached into his tunic and pulled out his own locket, holding it next to hers. The moment they came within inches of each other, both blazed with light, runes dancing across their surfaces in ancient script, singing with reunion. Catherine couldn't speak, couldn't think. The man she loved, who had rejected her, who had broken her heart, and her wolf was the lost prince. It was impossible. It was insane. "Where is he?" the king demanded, standing abruptly. "Where is Elian now?" "I don't know," she whispered. "After the rejection, I left. I couldn't stay in the lower districts where everyone knew. Everyone pitied me. I came here seeking work, hoping to disappear. I haven't seen him since." But the king was already moving, his beta racing alongside him, shouting orders that echoed through the castle like thunder. Guards mobilized, messengers were dispatched, and Catherine was left kneeling on the wet stones, her world shattered and reformed into something she couldn't recognize. They found him within hours. Elian Whitmore lived in a modest home in the southern district, working as a craftsman's apprentice, his life unremarkable except for the strange melancholy that clung to him like a second skin. When the king's guards arrived at his door, he thought he was being arrested for the crime of rejecting his mate. Rejection was not illegal, but it was shameful, and he had heard whispers that the king had a particular hatred for those who threw away the goddess's gifts. He was brought to the castle in chains of silver that burned his skin, his heart pounding with fear and confusion. They led him through corridors of impossible grandeur, past servants who averted their eyes, until finally he was thrust into the throne room where the Alpha King waited. Aiden stood before his throne, not sitting, his entire body vibrating with barely contained emotion. When Elian was pushed forward, their eyes met, and the king made a sound like a wounded animal. "The locket," he commanded. "Show me the locket you gave to the Omega." Elian's brow furrowed in confusion. "I don't have it anymore. I gave it to my girlfriend, before—" He stopped, shame coloring his face. "Before you rejected her," the king finished, his voice hard. "Yes." Elian lifted his chin, defiant despite his fear. "I had no choice. My mother said our family could never accept such a match, that it would destroy everything we'd built. I had to protect my future, my mother's reputation." "Your mother?" The king descended the steps slowly, each footfall echoing. "Tell me about your mother." "Her name is Celine Whitmore. She's a healer, well respected in the southern district. She raised me alone, never spoke of my father except to say he was dead." Elian's voice wavered slightly. "What does this have to do with anything? Why am I here?" The king stopped an arm's length away, studying him with an intensity that made Elian want to bare his throat in submission. "Where did you get the locket?" "It was my mother's. She said it was the only thing she had from my father, that she wanted me to have it, to give to someone I loved." The throne room doors opened, and Catherine was escorted in, her white hair freshly brushed, the locket still hanging from her neck. She looked ethereal and terrified, and when Elian saw her, his heart clenched with guilt and longing he had tried so hard to bury. "Catherine," he breathed. She didn't look at him, couldn't, her eyes fixed on the floor. The king gestured for her to come forward. She obeyed, moving like a dream, until she stood beside him. Then Aidan did something that made the entire room hold its breath. He removed his own locket and held it up. 23 years ago, I had 2 lockets made for my newborn son. One I placed around his neck. One I kept for myself. They were spelled to recognize each other, to glow in each other's presence, to be unmistakable. He looked at Elian with eyes full of decades of grief. Your mother took you from me when you were 3 days old. She was my mate, my queen, and she vanished without explanation, without mercy. I have searched for you every day since. Elian shook his head, backing away. No, my mother would never. She raised me, she loved me, she... Where is she now? The king interrupted. Where is Celine? At home, probably tending to her garden or preparing evening meals. Elian's voice failed him as the implications crashed over him like a wave. The king turned to his beta. Bring her, carefully. I want no harm to come to her, but I will have answers. As guards rushed to obey, Aidan approached Elian slowly, carefully, like one might approach a wounded animal. I know this is overwhelming. I know you have no reason to believe me, but... His voice cracked. But you are my son. I can feel it in my bones, in my wolf, in every part of me that has been broken since you were taken. Elian looked at this powerful man, this stranger who claimed to be his father, and felt something shift deep inside him. Memories flickered at the edges of his consciousness, fragments of dreams he'd had all his life. A warm embrace that smelled of cedar and power, a deep voice singing lullabies in the old language, a sense of belonging he'd never quite found. The locket around Catherine's neck pulsed with light, and his hand moved unconsciously toward it, toward her. She finally met his eyes, and he saw the betrayal there, the pain he had caused, mixed now with confusion, and something that might have been pity. I'm sorry, he whispered to her, though the words felt impossibly inadequate. Catherine, I'm so sorry. She said nothing, but tears traced silver paths down her pale cheeks. They waited in heavy silence for what felt like hours, but was barely one. When the doors opened again, a woman was escorted in, her hands bound loosely, her face pale but composed. Celine Whitmore was beautiful still, despite the years, her dark hair threaded with gray, her eyes the same stormy gray as her son's. When she saw Aidan, she stopped breathing. Aidan, she whispered, and there was such anguish in that single word that even the guards looked away. The king stood frozen, staring at the woman he had loved and lost, the woman who had destroyed him. Why? The word was torn from somewhere deep inside him. Why did you take him? Why did you let me believe you were dead? Let me search until I was half mad with grief. Celine's eyes closed, tears spilling down her face. Because I was dying. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, rippling outward in waves of shock. The healers told me 3 days after Elian was born. There was a poison in my blood, something from an assassination attempt that had finally taken root. They gave me months, maybe a year. She opened her eyes, meeting Aidan's gaze with terrible courage. I couldn't let you watch me die. I couldn't let our son's first memories be of his mother wasting away, of the court vultures circling, waiting to influence a grieving king. I thought if I left, you could move forward, find another mate, give the kingdom a healthy queen and more heirs. You thought you could make that choice for me? Aidan's voice was deadly quiet. You thought taking my son, letting me believe you were both dead, was mercy? I was wrong. Celine's voice broke. I was so wrong, but by the time I realized it, too much time had passed. The healers were wrong, Aidan. I didn't die. My wolf fought the poison, and I recovered. slowly, painfully. But by then, you had offered a reward for our return that made us targets for every mercenary and bounty hunter in the realm. I was terrified that in trying to return Elian to you, we would be killed by those seeking the reward, or that you would never forgive me, that you would take him from me as I had taken him from you. She looked at her son with such love and regret that it was painful to witness. So I hid us. I changed our names, suppressed my royal wolf, lived as a common healer. I told myself I was protecting him, giving him a normal life. But really, I was a coward. I was afraid of facing what I'd done. Elian's legs gave out, and he sank to his knees, his world crumbling around him. Everything you told me was a lie. Every story, every memory. Not everything, Celine said desperately, dropping to her knees as well despite her bonds. Your childhood was real. My love for you is real. The man you've become, kind and strong and good, that's all you. That's all true. But you let him suffer. Catherine spoke for the first time since entering, her voice stronger than anyone expected. You let the king search and grieve for 23 years. You let your son grow up without his father, without his birthright, without knowing who he truly was. Celine turned to look at her, seeing her truly for the first time, and something shifted in her expression. You're the one he rejected. The Omega. Yes. Catherine lifted her chin, her white hair catching the light like a halo. Because you told him our kind weren't worthy of your family. You taught him to be ashamed of the goddess's gift, to value status and reputation over the sacred bond. The accusation hung in the air, and Celine's face crumpled. I did. I thought I was teaching him to survive in a world that would judge him for my sins. I thought... She looked at Aiden, at the guards, at the magnificent throne room. I thought I had made him unfit for all of this. So I taught him to be small, to be safe, to not reach for things beyond our station. I didn't realize I was teaching him to reject the best parts of himself. Aiden moved then, crossing to Elian and kneeling beside him. Up close, the resemblance was undeniable. The same strong jaw, the same proud nose, the same storm-gray eyes that Elian had inherited from his mother, but which held his father's intensity. Look at me, the king commanded softly. Elian raised his head, tears streaming down his face. You are my son. You are Prince Elian Silverlake, heir to this kingdom, and nothing in this world or the next, will ever change that. Aiden's hands gripped Elian's shoulders. Your mother made terrible choices born of fear and pain, but you are here now. You are found, and if you will let me, I will spend the rest of my life making up for the years we lost. I don't know how to be a prince, Elian choked out. I don't know how to be your son. Then we will learn together. Aiden pulled him into an embrace, and Elian shattered, sobbing against his father's shoulder like the child he had been when he was taken. Finally home. Celine wept silently, watching them, and no one moved to comfort her. She had made her choices, and now she would face their consequences. But Catherine, soft-hearted despite everything, knelt beside the former queen and whispered, You saved yourself when you thought you were dying. Maybe now you can save what's left of your family. Celine looked at this white-haired Omega with wonder and gratitude, seeing in her the grace she herself had lacked. The days that followed were a tempest of revelation and adjustment. The kingdom learned that their lost prince had been found, and celebrations erupted in the streets even as the full story was carefully guarded. Celine was not imprisoned, but she was not free either, her fate to be decided once the initial storm had passed. Elian struggled with his new identity, moving through the castle like a stranger in a foreign land. Tutors were assigned to teach him history, politics, combat, and magic. He was fitted for clothes that cost more than everything he had owned in his previous life combined. He was introduced to nobles who bowed and scraped, their eyes calculating what favor they might gain from the newfound prince. Through it all, Aiden was a constant presence, patient and fierce by turns, determined to forge a relationship with this son, who was both his blood and a stranger. They took meals together, trained together, walked the castle grounds in the early morning, when the world was soft with mist and possibility. "Tell me about your life," Aiden would say, and Elian would share stories of his childhood, the modest joys and simple sorrows. In return, Aiden spoke of the kingdom, of the weight of crown and responsibility, but also of his own boyhood, before duty had hardened him into the king he had become. They were finding each other, piece by piece, building a bridge across 23 years of absence. But there was a shadow that followed Elian through every gleaming corridor, a ghost that haunted his dreams. Catherine. She worked in the castle still, head down, white hair hiding her face, and she avoided him like he carried plague. He would catch glimpses of her rounding corners, hear her soft footsteps retreating when he approached, and each avoidance was a knife between his ribs. He had rejected her. He had taken the goddess's gift and thrown it back in her face, because his mother had taught him to be ashamed of what he was, where he came from. The irony was not lost on him that he had denied his mate, because he thought he wasn't good enough, only to discover he was a prince. But being a prince didn't change what he had done. Didn't heal the bond he had severed, didn't erase the pain he had caused. One night, unable to bear it any longer, he found her in the laundry, working late to avoid the other servants. She startled when he entered, her hands stilling on the linen she was folding. "Please don't run," he said quietly, staying near the door, giving her space. "I just want to talk." "There's nothing to say, Your Highness." Her voice was carefully neutral, but he could hear the tremor beneath it. "Don't call me that. I'm still just Elian, still the same person you—" He stopped, because that was a lie, wasn't it? He wasn't the same. Everything had changed. The same person who rejected me? She finally looked at him, and her eyes were dry but devastated. The same person who said I would ruin his future? The words hit like physical blows. I was wrong. Catherine, I was so wrong. I let fear and shame guide me instead of listening to my wolf, to my heart. I thought I was protecting you, protecting my mother, but I was just being a coward. You were, she agreed simply. You were a coward, and you broke something in me that I don't know how to fix. Elian took a careful step forward. The bond isn't completely severed. I can still feel it, faint but there, like a thread waiting to be strengthened. Can't you feel it too? She turned away, her hands resuming their work, but he saw them shake. What I feel doesn't matter. You're a prince now. I'm an Omega from the lower districts, exactly what your mother taught you to despise. The rejection stands. My father was ready to tear the kingdom apart to find his mate and son. He ruled alone for 23 years, rather than take another queen. Elian's voice grew stronger, more certain. He taught me these past weeks that true strength isn't in status or power. It's in honoring the bonds that make us whole. You are my mate, Catherine. The goddess herself chose us for each other. No crown, no title, nothing in this world is more important than that. She whirled to face him, anger finally breaking through her careful control. You don't get to do this. You don't get to reject me when it was inconvenient and then claim me now that it serves your purposes. I'm not a toy to be picked up and discarded on your whims. You're right. He stood his ground, letting her rage wash over him. You're absolutely right. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't deserve another chance. But I'm asking anyway because the alternative is spending the rest of my life knowing I threw away the greatest gift I could ever receive. Pretty words from a prince. But her voice had lost some of its edge. Not a prince. Not to you. He slowly, carefully, lowered himself to his knees before her. Just a man who made the worst mistake of his life, and who will spend every day trying to make it right if you'll let him. Catherine stared down at him. This man who had broken her heart, who had discovered he was royalty, who was now kneeling in a laundry room like a supplicant before a goddess. It would be so easy to turn away, to let bitterness harden her heart completely. But she had felt the bond too, thin and fragile but stubbornly alive, and her wolf whimpered with longing for its mate. "I can't just forgive you," she whispered. "I can't just forget the pain. I'm not asking you to forget. I'm asking you to let me try to heal it." He looked up at her with those storm-gray eyes that had haunted her dreams. "Give me a chance to prove that I'm more than my worst moment. Let me show you that you are valued, treasured, worthy of every good thing this world has to offer." She was silent for a long moment, warring with herself. Finally, she said, "I won't make it easy for you." Hope flared in his chest like a sunrise. "I don't want easy. I want you." "Then stand up," she commanded softly, "and start by treating me like a person, not a broken thing you need to fix." He stood, and for the first time in months, they simply looked at each other without pain clouding every glance. It was a beginning, fragile and uncertain, but a beginning nonetheless. The castle watched with interest as the prince began courting the white-haired Omega with a devotion that bordered on reverence. He brought her flowers from the royal gardens, rare blooms that had never been offered to a servant. He sought her out for walks in the evening, speaking of everything and nothing, slowly rebuilding trust one conversation at a time. He asked about her life, her dreams, her thoughts on everything from politics to poetry, and he listened like her words were scripture. Aidan observed this courtship with approval and a hint of amusement. He called Catherine to his private study one afternoon, and she went with trepidation, unsure what the king might want with her. He was standing by the window when she entered, his back to her, but he turned immediately and gestured for her to sit. She perched on the edge of a chair, still uncomfortable with such informality in the presence of royalty. "You don't need to fear me," Aidan said gently, taking a seat across from her. "You wear my son's locket. In many ways, you brought him back to me. I owe you a debt I can never repay. I didn't do anything, Your Majesty. I just wore a gift She hesitated. "A gift I was given. You survived rejection with your spirit intact. You chose work over bitterness. You showed my former mate compassion when no one else would." He leaned forward, his dark eyes kind. "My son tells me you're refusing his suit." She flushed. "I'm not refusing exactly. I'm just taking my time." "Good." The king's smile was fierce. "Make him work for it. Make him prove that he's worthy of the gift the goddess gave him. But know this, Catherine of the white hair, if you choose to accept him, you will be welcomed into this family with all the honor due a princess of this realm." Tears pricked her eyes. "I'm nobody, Your Majesty. An Omega with no family, no status. You are my son's mate. That makes you somebody to me." He reached across and took her hand, his grip warm and steady. Celine made many mistakes, but one of her worst was teaching Elian that worth is measured by birth rather than character. Don't let her poisonous lessons make you doubt your own value. She nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. "Besides," Aidan added with a hint of humor, "have you seen how miserable he is when you're not around? The boy mopes like a kicked puppy. It's undignified for a prince." A surprised laugh escaped her, and she felt some of the tightness in her chest ease. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, carefully, Catherine allowed herself to hope. Elian kept his promises, showing up day after day, patient and persistent, never pushing, but always present. He was learning to be a prince, but he was also learning to be the man she needed, the mate she deserved. They were in the garden one evening, the air soft with early spring, when she finally let him hold her hand. It was such a small thing, fingers intertwining, but the bond between them flared to life like it had been waiting for this permission, flooding them both with warmth and rightness. "I've missed this," Elian breathed, his thumb stroking over her knuckles. "I've missed you. Missed us. Every single day." "I've missed it too," she admitted. "Even when I was furious with you. Even when I wanted to hate you. I missed having you beside me." He turned to face her fully, raising her hand to press it against his chest where his heart thundered. "I won't reject you again. Not ever. I swear on my life, on my crown, on everything I am and hope to be." She could feel the truth of it through the bond, could sense his wolf's desperate need to make amends with hers. "I believe you," she whispered. "Then will you accept me?" He held his breath, every part of him focused on her answer. "Will you let me complete our bond, claim you as mine, and be claimed as yours?" The garden seemed to hold its breath with him, flowers bending close as if to hear her response. "Yes." The word was soft but certain, and as soon as it left her lips, Elian pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her white hair, inhaling her scent like a drowning man finding air. The bond snapped fully into place, stronger than before, glowing with golden light that made the evening dim in comparison. Both of them gasped at the intensity of it, the completion, the absolute rightness of two souls recognizing each other and choosing to intertwine. When they finally pulled apart enough to look at each other, both were crying, but these were tears of joy, of healing, of new beginnings. "I love you," Elian said, the words he had been too afraid to speak before. "I loved you before, but I was too broken to admit it. I love you now, and I will love you tomorrow and every day after." "I love you too," Catherine replied, and felt the last of her broken pieces click back into place. "Even when I shouldn't have, even when you hurt me, some part of me never stopped loving you." They sealed their reunion with a kiss, soft and sweet and full of promise, and the garden burst into bloom around them, responding to the magic of a bond fulfilled. The formal bonding ceremony was held under the full moon, as tradition dictated. The entire kingdom was invited, and they came in droves, curious to see the white-haired Omega who had captured the heart of their lost prince. Catherine wore a gown of silver that made her look like she was carved from starlight, and the golden locket rested against her throat, no longer a reminder of loss, but a symbol of destiny fulfilled. Elian stood beside her in ceremonial armor that had been his father's, his own locket catching the moonlight. And when they spoke their vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the assembly. Aiden performed the ceremony himself, his voice strong and clear as he bound their hands with silk cords and blessed their union in the old language. When he pronounced them bonded mates, the crowd erupted in cheers that could be heard for miles. But the king's own happiness was bittersweet. He had his son back, yes, and soon would have a daughter-in-law who already felt like family. But Celine was a shadow that still haunted the edges of his joy. She had been confined to a tower room, not quite a prisoner, but not free, while he decided her fate. The law was clear about what she had done, kidnapping the heir, depriving the kingdom of its prince, but his heart was less certain. She had been his mate once, his love, and despite everything, some part of him still remembered what that had meant. One night, after the celebrations had died down and the castle slept, Aiden climbed the stairs to her tower. He found her standing by the window, looking out at the kingdom she had once been meant to rule, her face lined with regret. "Aiden," she said without turning, somehow knowing it was him. "Celine." He stood in the doorway, neither entering nor leaving. "The ceremony was beautiful. I watched from here." She finally turned to face him, and he was struck by how much older she looked, how worn down by guilt and grief. She's good for him. The Omega, I mean. Catherine. She has a strength I never did. Why did you really leave? He asked, the question that had haunted him for 2 decades. Tell me the truth. All of it. She was silent for a long moment, gathering her courage. I was afraid, she finally said. Afraid of dying? Yes. But more afraid of failing. I was never supposed to be Queen Aiden. I was a healer's daughter who caught a king's eye, and every day I felt like I was playing a role I didn't deserve. When I got pregnant, when Elian was born, that fear multiplied tenfold. I was terrified I would mess him up, that my inadequacy would somehow taint him. She wrapped her arms around herself. When the healers told me I was dying, it felt almost like relief. A way out of a role I was failing at anyway. I told myself I was protecting you and Elian, but really, I was running from my own fear of not being enough. Aiden moved into the room then, crossing to stand near her. You were enough. You were always enough. I chose you, Celine. Not because you were perfect, but because you made me want to be a better man. And I repaid that by becoming your worst nightmare. She laughed bitterly. I gave our son abandonment issues and taught him to be ashamed of who he was. I took away 23 years we can never get back. How do you forgive something like that? I don't know, Aiden admitted. Part of me wants to hate you for what you did. Part of me wants to lock you in this tower for the rest of your life and throw away the key. But, she prompted softly, but you're still my mate. The bond was never broken, just buried under anger and grief. And despite everything, Elian turned out to be a good man, kind and strong. You did that. You raised him, shaped him, loved him. Whatever else you did wrong, you did that right. Celine's eyes filled with tears. What happens now? Now? Aiden considered. Now we figure out how to be a family again, broken and strange as that family might be. Elian needs his mother. He's angry with you, but he loves you too, and that won't just disappear. And He paused, struggling with the words. I need closure, need to understand, need to grieve what we lost, and maybe, eventually, figure out what we can salvage. I don't deserve your mercy, she whispered. Probably not, he agreed. But our son deserves to have his mother at his wedding, at the birth of his children, in his life. So we'll find a way forward, not for us, but for him. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Thank you. He didn't respond, just inclined his head and left her there with her gratitude and her regrets. The seasons turned, and life in the castle found a new rhythm. Elian threw himself into his training with fierce dedication, determined to be worthy of the crown he would one day inherit. He studied statecraft with his father's advisors, trained in combat with the kingdom's finest warriors, learned the intricacies of law and diplomacy that would be required of a king. His days began before dawn, in the training yards where the morning mist clung to the ground like silver ghosts. His combat instructor was a grizzled warrior named Theron, who had served Aiden since before Elian was born, and who showed no mercy to the young prince despite his royal status. Again, Theron would bark, circling Elian as they sparred with wooden swords that left bruises despite their dull edges. You're favoring your left side. An enemy will exploit that weakness in seconds. Elian would adjust, muscle memory slowly building through repetition and pain. His wolf prowled beneath his skin, eager to be unleashed, but control was everything. A king who couldn't master himself could never master a kingdom. After combat training came lessons in the Great Library, a vast room that smelled of old leather and older secrets. Lord Cassius, the kingdom's chief advisor, was a man of infinite patience and even greater cunning. He taught Elian to read between the lines of correspondence, to understand the web of alliances and enmities that held the kingdom together. A king must be both lion and fox, Cassius would say, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Strong enough to defend, clever enough to avoid unnecessary battles. Tell me, Prince Elian, if the southern territories demand lower taxes while the northern lords require more troops for their borders, how do you satisfy both without weakening the crown? These were puzzles with no perfect solutions, only calculated compromises, and Elian learned to navigate them with growing confidence. But it was exhausting, this constant weight of decisions that affected thousands of lives. In the afternoons, Aidan would summon him to the throne room to observe court proceedings. Elian stood at his father's right hand, silent and attentive, watching how the king dispensed justice, mediated disputes, and made pronouncements that shaped the realm. He saw his father's wisdom, but also his weariness, the way decades of rule had carved lines into his face and shadows beneath his eyes. "What did you learn today?" Aidan would ask, as they walked back to the royal quarters afterward. "That being king means everyone wants something from you, and no decision will please everyone," Elian replied one evening, frustration coloring his voice. Aidan smiled grimly. "An accurate assessment. But you also learned, I hope, that fairness matters more than popularity, and that a king who tries to please everyone ends up serving no one." These conversations were precious to both of them, father and son finding their way to each other through shared purpose and mutual respect. But Elian also made time for his mate, for long walks in the garden and quiet evenings by the fire, for laughter and tenderness, and the slow building of a life together. Catherine, for her part, was learning to be a princess, though she chafed against the formality of it all. She preferred working in the gardens or visiting the lower Aidan watched them with pride and a bittersweet ache. They were so young, so full of hope and possibility, everything he and Celine had been before fear had torn them apart. He had slowly begun allowing Celine more freedom, letting her attend dinners and court functions, though she kept to the edges, still not fully accepted back into the fold. One evening, as Aidan sat in his study going over reports, Elian knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a privilege afforded only to family. "Father," he said, and Aidan still felt a thrill every time he heard that word. "I want to talk to you about Mother." Aidan set down his papers, giving his son his full attention. "What about her?" "She's miserable. She puts on a brave face, but I can see how much she's suffering, how much she regrets what she did." Elian sat across from his father. "I've been angry with her, and I'm not saying I'm not still working through that. But she's my mother. She raised me, loved me, even if she made terrible choices, and she's your mate, Father. The bond is still there. I can see it whenever you're in the same room." "What are you suggesting?" Aidan asked carefully. "I'm suggesting you talk to her, really talk to her. Not as king to subject, but as mate to mate. Figure out if there's anything left worth saving." Elian leaned forward. "You've spent 23 years searching for us. Don't spend the rest of your life holding on to anger when you could be healing instead." Aidan was silent for a long moment. "You're wise beyond your years." "I have a good teacher," Elian replied with a small smile. That night, Aidan went to Celine's tower again, but this time he brought wine and 2 glasses. She looked up in surprise when he entered, setting down the book she'd been reading. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Not as king and criminal, but as Aidan and Celine, the way we used to." She nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in her throat. They sat by the fire, and for the first time in over 2 decades they talked. Really talked. About the past, about their mistakes, about the fear and pain and grief that had shaped them. They talked about Elian, about the man he had become, about the years they had both missed. They talked until the fire burned low and the night grew deep, and somewhere in all those words, they began to find their way back to each other. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. It wasn't even reconciliation. But it was a beginning. A tiny crack in the wall of anger and hurt that had stood between them for so long. Days turned into weeks, and those tentative conversations became a regular occurrence. Aidan found himself seeking Celine out, asking her opinion on Elian's training, discussing kingdom matters, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence the way they used to. The mate bond, dormant for so long, began to strengthen again, warming the cold places in both their hearts. Catherine noticed the change and encouraged it. "Love is too rare a thing to waste," she told Elian when he expressed concern. "If they can find their way back to each other, shouldn't we support that?" And so the castle watched as their king and his long-lost queen slowly, carefully, fell in love again. It was different this time, tempered by loss and matured by suffering, but perhaps deeper and more real for all of that. On the anniversary of Elian's return, Aidan made an announcement that shocked the court. He was reinstating Celine as his queen, not erasing what she had done, but acknowledging that people were more than their worst mistakes, that love could survive even terrible betrayals if both parties were willing to fight for it. There was grumbling among the nobles, of course, those who felt she should be punished more harshly. But the king's word was law, and gradually, the kingdom accepted their queen's return. Elian stood beside his father at the ceremony, and when Celine was crowned anew, tears streaming down her face, he stepped forward and embraced her, publicly forgiving her and welcoming her back into the family. It was a moment of grace that the kingdom would remember for generations. That night, the royal family gathered for dinner in the private chambers. No servants, no guards, just Aidan, Celine, Elian, and Catherine. They laughed and talked and shared stories, weaving together the separate threads of their lives into a tapestry of family. "I never thought I'd have this again," Aidan admitted, looking around the table at the faces he loved. "A family, a future, hope." "We all deserve second chances," Celine said softly, reaching across to take his hand. "Thank you for giving me mine." Elian and Catherine exchanged a glance, their bond humming with contentment. Against all odds, despite pain and separation, and nearly impossible circumstances, they had found their way to this moment. This perfect, imperfect family, built from broken pieces made whole. As the months passed, Elian's training intensified. He was being groomed to take over the kingdom, to step into his father's enormous footsteps. And the weight of it sometimes felt crushing. But Catherine was always there, his anchor and his comfort, reminding him that he didn't have to be perfect, just present. Aidan watched his son grow into his role with fierce pride, and one day he called Elian to his study. "It's time," he said simply. "Time for what?" Elian asked, though something in his father's tone made his heart beat faster. "Time for me to officially name you Crown Prince and begin transitioning power to you." Aidan stood, moving to look out the window at the kingdom stretching below. "I'm not a young man anymore, and I've spent too many years in grief and searching. I want to enjoy what time I have left with your mother, to travel, to simply be Aidan instead of always being the king." Elian felt panic flutter in his chest. "I'm not ready." "No one ever is," Aidan said with a smile, turning to face him. "But you're as ready as you're going to be. You have a good heart, a strong wolf, and a mate who will stand beside you and keep you grounded. That's more than most kings have." But before the ceremony could be held, darkness descended upon the kingdom in an unexpected form. A plague swept through the lower districts, swift and merciless, leaving death and despair in its wake. The royal healers were overwhelmed, their traditional remedies proving useless against this new affliction. Catherine was in the lower districts when the first cases appeared, and she refused to leave despite the danger. She worked herself to exhaustion, her healing magic pushed to its limits as she tried to save as many as she could. But for every life she saved, 2 more fell ill. Elian defied his father's orders to stay in the castle, rushing to Catherine's side. He found her in a makeshift hospital, her white hair pulled back, her clothes stained with blood and other fluids, her face drawn with exhaustion and grief, "You shouldn't be here," she said when she saw him, but there was no strength behind the words. "Neither should you, yet here we are." He rolled up his sleeves and began helping, using his strength to move patients, his presence to provide comfort to the dying. They worked side by side for days that blurred into weeks, barely sleeping, barely eating, pushing themselves and their bond to the breaking point. The plague seemed unstoppable, and the death toll climbed higher each day. It was Celine who discovered the cure, working tirelessly in her laboratory, combining her knowledge as a healer with ancient texts she had studied in her years of hiding. The remedy required rare ingredients and powerful magic, but it worked. The first patient to receive it recovered within hours, and hope blazed to life like a phoenix from ashes. But there wasn't enough of the cure to treat everyone at once. It had to be made in small batches, the ingredients carefully prepared, the magic precisely channeled. Every moment counted, and Catherine and Celine worked together, mother-in-law and daughter-in-law united in purpose, creating batch after batch while Elian and Aidan coordinated distribution. The king himself went into the plague districts, his presence rallying the people, reminding them that they were not forgotten, not abandoned. He helped distribute the cure, held the hands of the dying, and wept with those who had lost loved ones. It was a side of their king the people had never seen, and they loved him all the more for it. When the plague finally broke, when the last patient recovered and the death toll stopped climbing, the kingdom was forever changed. The people had seen their future king and his white-haired mate risk everything to save them. They had witnessed the king's compassion and the queen's brilliance. The royal family was no longer distant figures on a throne, but real people who bled and suffered and sacrificed alongside their subjects. Lord Valerius and his faction of nobles found their opposition crumbling. How could they claim the prince was weak when he had faced death without flinching? How could they denounce the Omega Princess when she had saved hundreds with her healing? Even the most traditional among them had to acknowledge that something profound had shifted. But the plague had taken its toll on Catherine in ways that weren't immediately visible. She had pushed her healing magic too far, too fast, drawing on reserves she didn't have, burning through her own life force to save others. In the aftermath, as the kingdom celebrated their survival, she began to fade. It started with exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure, then progressed to weakness that made even simple tasks difficult. Elian watched in growing horror as his mate grew paler, thinner, her white hair losing its luster, her eyes dimming like stars at dawn. The royal healers examined her and delivered their verdict with grave faces. She had depleted her magic so severely that her wolf might never fully recover. She needed time to heal, months or even years of rest. But even then, there were no guarantees. She might remain weakened forever, might never be able to use her healing gift again. Elian was devastated. He blamed himself for not stopping her, for not forcing her to rest, for letting her sacrifice so much. He sat beside her bed day and night, holding her hand, willing his own strength into her through their bond. "Don't be foolish," Catherine whispered, her voice paper-thin. "You can't heal this by wishing it away." "Then what can I do?" His voice broke on the question. "How do I fix this?" "You don't. I made my choice, Elian. I would make it again." She squeezed his hand weakly. "Those people are alive because of what we did. That matters more than my power." But Elian couldn't accept it. He searched frantically for a cure, consulting with every healer, witch, and wise woman in the kingdom. He offered fortunes for information, threatened and pleaded, but nothing worked. Catherine continued to decline, and the joy of their survival was poisoned by the fear of losing her. It was Aidan who finally made him see reason. The king came to Catherine's chambers one evening and found his son hollow-eyed and desperate, surrounded by books and scrolls and remedies that hadn't worked. "Elian," he said gently, "you need to stop." "I can't. I won't lose her, father. I can't." You're losing yourself instead, and that helps no one. Aiden sat beside his son, his own eyes reflecting deep understanding of that particular anguish. I know what it's like to watch someone you love slip away, to feel powerless to stop it. But this isn't the same. Catherine isn't dying. She's recovering slowly in her own time. You need to trust that she's strong enough to heal. But what if she never? Then you love her anyway. You adapt, you adjust. You find new ways to live and serve and be together. Aiden gripped Elian's shoulder firmly. She doesn't need you to fix her. She needs you to be with her, to support her, to remember that she's more than her healing power, more than her magic. She's your mate, your partner, and she needs you whole, not broken by guilt and fear. The words hit Elian like cold water, shocking him back to clarity. He looked at Catherine sleeping in the bed, her face peaceful despite her weakness, and realized his father was right. He had been so focused on curing her that he had forgotten simply to be present with her, to cherish what they had, rather than mourning what might be lost. From that day forward, he changed his approach. Instead of desperately seeking cures, he focused on her comfort and happiness. He read to her, told her stories, brought her flowers from the garden, and sang her the old songs his mother had taught him. He opened the windows so she could feel the breeze and hear the birds, arranged for musicians to play softly in her chambers, and made sure she knew every moment that she was loved, valued, cherished for who she was, not what she could do. Slowly, gradually, Catherine began to improve. The color returned to her cheeks, strength to her limbs. Her wolf, battered but not broken, began to heal. It took months, and she would never be quite as powerful as she had been, but she recovered enough to walk the gardens again, to smile and laugh, to live. The experience changed them both, deepened their bond in ways that prosperity never could. They had faced the darkness together and emerged scarred but stronger, their love tested and proven unbreakable. When Catherine was finally well enough to leave her chambers regularly, the kingdom rejoiced. They had watched their future princess fight death to save them, then fight death again for herself, and they loved her with a fierce loyalty that no amount of royal breeding could have earned. It was after her recovery, on a crisp autumn morning, when the leaves painted the garden in flames of gold and crimson, that Elian took Catherine to their favorite spot by the fountain and knelt before her once more. I knelt before you once and asked for forgiveness, he said, his storm-gray eyes bright with emotion. I knelt before you again and asked you to accept our bond. Now I kneel before you a third time, not to ask for anything, but to give you something. He pulled out a ring, simple but exquisite, with a stone the color of moonlight. This ring belonged to my great-grandmother, the first Omega Queen to rule beside an Alpha King. My father gave it to me and said it should go to someone who embodied the same strength and grace she did. He slipped it onto her finger, where it caught the morning light, and threw it back in silver sparks. You are my mate, my love, my partner in all things, but I want the world to know you're also my choice, the one I would choose again and again, in this life, and every life after. Catherine's eyes filled with tears as she pulled him up and kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into that connection. Around them, the garden seemed to hold its breath, and when they finally pulled apart, she whispered, I would choose you too. Always. The ceremony to name Elian Crown Prince was held a month later, grand and solemn, as Elian knelt before his father and was named heir to the kingdom. The golden locket gleamed at his throat, no longer a mystery, but a symbol of destiny fulfilled, and beside him, Catherine stood in her own finery, a princess in all but name. When Aiden placed the circlet of the crown prince on Elian's head, he leaned close and whispered, You will be greater than I ever was. I know it. Elian felt the weight of that crown, both literal and figurative. But he also felt the warmth of his father's pride, his mother's tearful joy, and his mate's unshakable faith. He could do this. They could do this together. The kingdom celebrated their crown prince and future king, and as the festivities rang through the night, the royal family stood on the castle balcony, looking out at the lights and laughter below. "This is what I fought for," Aiden said quietly, his arm around Selena's waist. "This moment, this family, this legacy." "We found our way home," Selena replied, leaning into him. "All of us, in our own ways." Elian and Catherine stood with their hands clasped, watching the celebration, feeling the weight and wonder of the future stretching before them. They had been broken, all of them, scattered pieces of a family torn apart by fear and fate, but they had found each other again. And in that finding, they had become something new, something stronger. The white-haired Omega who had thought she was nothing was now beloved by a kingdom. The lost prince had found not just his throne, but his purpose. The grieving king had reclaimed his family and his heart, and the wayward queen had found her way back from the wilderness of her mistakes. As the moon rose full and bright above the castle, blessing them with silver light, the lockets around Elian and Aiden's necks glowed softly, no longer separated but reunited, their magic complete. And in that glow was a promise, a legacy that would pass from father to son to future generations, a reminder that no matter how lost one becomes, love can always light the way home. The story of the rejected Omega and the lost prince would be told for centuries, a tale of pain and redemption, of love strong enough to bridge decades and forgive unforgivable wrongs. And at its heart was a simple golden locket, a father's gift to his son, that had traveled through darkness and despair to bring a family back together again. This was their triumph. This was their truth. This was their forever, hard-won and precious beyond measure, built from ashes and hope, and the unbreakable bonds that make us whole. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this beautiful love story. Let us know what you thought of this tale full of emotions and surprises. Tell us your name, where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10 if it touched your heart. And if you enjoyed the plot, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. See you next time.